Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio, Progressive Radio Network, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and at opednews.com/podcasts with an S. My guest for this show is Jamie Susskind. He's a barrister, which is in the UK, kind of like an attorney. He's a past fellow of Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. And he's the author of a new book, Future Politics, Living Together in a World Transformed by Tech. So in your acknowledgments, you thank Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, prime ministers, for having read your book. That's pretty amazing. I mean, and it tells us the importance of this book, really. You've got a book that is looking at the future of politics, so I want to congratulate you on that. And one other acknowledgement that you gave was that Howard Gardner had read the book in its entirety, and he's one of my heroes, the creator of multiple intelligences theory. So at some point, I'd like to hear about what his thoughts about this were. But I want you to start off, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Tell us your Gladstone Faraday story, your self-driving car example, and Henry Ford's faster horses story, to kind of set us up. I think that's a good way to set us up.
So William Gladstone was the Prime Minister here in the UK, and Michael Faraday is one of the great scientists of all time. This is in the 19th century, and this story is told of an encounter between the two of them where Faraday is showing Gladstone the invention of electricity in the laboratory. And Gladstone, who was a great statesman, asked Professor Faraday, what is this for? What does it do? And Faraday gave a scientific answer. But Gladstone said, yes, but what does it do? And again, Faraday gave an answer about how it could be applied in the laboratory and the like. And Gladstone said, yes, but what does it do? And Faraday eventually lost his temper, his patience, and replied, well, in due course, I'm sure you'll find a way of taxing it. And I tell that story because I think that it shows a broader pattern that remains to this day between people who know a lot about politics, but not that much about tech, the Gladstones of the world, and those who know a lot about science and tech, but perhaps less about politics and morality and philosophy, which is the Faradays of the world. The self-driving car story example I often give is, I ask people to imagine they're taking a drive in a self-driving car for the first time. And for whatever reason, they want to go over the speed limit. Perhaps they're in a rush to get to the hospital. Not seriously over the speed limit, but just a little bit. And the car refuses. Or they want to park illegally in a spot where they're not allowed just for a few minutes, but the car refuses. Or they want to drive through property which the GPS systems tell that car would be trespassing. The car refuses. Or a police car comes along and orders it to pull over, and for whatever reason, the passenger doesn't want to, but the car itself is programmed to pull over. And what we have there is an example of where, through our interaction with technology and the rules that are embedded in the code inside that technology, we are subject to the power of those who control that technology and who write the rules for it. And I foresee a world in which we increasingly live our lives through tech, and therefore are increasingly subject to the rules that other people have written.
And then last, the Henry Ford.
Well, Henry Ford used to say to people that Henry Ford was obviously the guy who brought the car to the mass market, the automobile. And he used to say to people, if I'd asked folk what they'd wanted, they'd have told me they wanted faster horses. And I think a lot of our thinking about the future of politics is faster horses thinking. We tend to imagine the world as a faster or sleeker version of what we have today, rather than something completely different, as different from today as a car was from a faster horse. And my whole book is an effort to say, actually, this could be potentially transformative for the way we live together, the developments that are taking place in technology, as significant as the invention of writing or the agricultural revolution.
And you talk about how you refer to politics as kind of a way we think about our collective lives.
That's right.
And in my exploration of the world of bottom up and top down, collective is probably, along with democratization, those are the two words that were most often used to look at bottom up. So how do you see politics as a collective thing? Talk about that.
Well, politics is about how we live together in a world where there's only one person, or where people live entirely separately from each other. There is no politics. But as soon as human beings decide they want to live together as more than one in any kind of unit, be it a family, a tribe, a city, a state, a kingdom, an empire, that is when politics arises, and it gives rise to choices about how we order and bind our collective lives together, and how we might order and bind it differently.
Now, you've looked at kind of the history of politics. How has it changed?
How has politics changed over time?
Yeah.
Well,
Because that's really what you say in the book is that most of the people who study politics have looked at the history of it, and very few look at the future of it, which is what your book is about. So let's start off by looking at what everybody's done, rather than and then we can get into where you've taken us.
Well, the history of politics is a big topic, and not one that I would want to try and summarize in one sentence or even one podcast. And I'm not dodging your question. I think the point that I make about the past is this: that political theorists, and I consider myself a political theorist, who write about the ideas and words we use to speak and think about politics, so concepts like liberty and democracy and power, they're very good at looking at the past and understanding what those ideas meant in context. You know, what did the word power mean in 17th century France as opposed to 20th century United States? But what's strange about the discipline of political philosophy is that although we're so sensitive to context in the past, we often write as if the future will be the same in 2050 as it was in 1950. And political philosophy, political theory, is very slow to adapt to what I see as fundamental societal changes. And that's another reason why we tend to imagine the future in terms only of today. The words and the language and the theories we have are mind-forged manacles, which limit our ability to think clearly about the future.
Great word, mind-forged manacles.
Well, it's not mine, it's William Blake's phrase.
Okay.
I should have done quotation marks, mind-forged manacles. But the idea that through the scarcity of words and concepts that we have at our disposal, we box ourselves in when we think about the future. And again, it leads to faster horses thinking, because if you just think the future is going to be horses, you can't possibly conceive of the car.
So let's hit it. Go with what are your concerns about the future of politics?
Well, I have lots of concerns, but the book, the stuff I write about in the book is how technology is going to transform the way we live together. And I should say that it gives rise to concerns on the one hand, but also extraordinary opportunities and potential joys on the other hand as well. But my view is that those who control the most powerful technologies will increasingly control the rest of us. And those might be nation states. They might be big tech firms. They're unlikely in the short term, unless we do something about it, to be ordinary citizens, ordinary punters like you and me. And so I think the big political question of the century that's unfolding in front of us is going to be different from what it was in the past. I think in the 20th century, the big political question was, what should be done by the market and what should be done by the state? How far should the state encroach into the world of civil society? And that was obviously the issue that divided the Western Hemisphere from the Eastern Hemisphere for much of the last century. And within each society, it divided left from right. I think that the future is going to be about a different question, just to what extent should our lives be directed and framed by powerful digital systems, and on what terms? And if I'm right about that, then we're nowhere in terms of theorizing the kinds of problems and issues that this could throw up, which is why in my book, I just go back to basics. I look at the very simple concepts of power, freedom, democracy, justice. And I ask, what could tech mean for each of those? And can those concepts even adequately encompass the problems and challenges thrown up by tech?
And you talk in the beginning, you cite Marx and Berners-Lee talking about the idea of building a future, of engineering and planning and creating a future. And I think that's part of the goal of this book, is to stop reflexively reacting to the technology and start thinking about it. You refer to Berners-Lee's concept of a kind of a philosophy of engineering the future.
Philosophical engineers is what Berners-Lee speaks about. But stepping back, the bigger point is this: we're often met with claims by people who work in tech that what they're doing is fundamentally changing the world. We're not just making money, we're transforming the world. And taking that with a pinch of salt, because a lot of them aren't changing the world, but many of them are and will do in the future. And if that's the case, if you're going to take on the burden of changing the world, you should take on the associated burden of understanding the consequences of those changes, moral, philosophical, political. And that's where Berners-Lee comes in. I think he says, when he and the others who invented the World Wide Web were philosophical engineers, I'm not sure the same can be said of a lot of people who work in Silicon Valley or the other tech hubs around the world. And I think if you look at a lot of the big tech firms today, I don't know how philosophical they are. And to a certain extent, that's understandable, because ultimately, whatever they profess, they remain commercial entities pursuing profit in the context of a capitalist economy. But when they have such profound implications for stuff that's nothing to do with commerce, freedom, democracy, justice, and the like, the rest of us have to step in and say, hey, the bottom line can't be the only consideration that comes into play when you design and engineer these platforms and products.
I think I heard you say in a question and answer session at Google, when you spoke there, that I'm not sure you said it exactly that way, but you kind of characterized Mark Zuckerberg with his power through Facebook as perhaps as powerful as a president. And, I would think, you've got Jeff Bezos and you got Jack Dorsey and a couple others who run these massive superpowered platforms that really are in some ways the new kinds of digital potentates.
If I did do that, and I think that might have been the questioner who suggested that, then I was both right and wrong. I was right to suggest that the people who run these tech firms have extraordinary amounts of power,
Yes.
which we can safely call political power. The reason I don't like comparing them to a president is the same reason that I don't like comparing Google to a state. It illustrates exactly the point I was making a minute ago about mind-forged manacles. We don't have the words, the political vocabulary to describe the kind of power that Mark Zuckerberg has or that Google has. And so we have to use analogies like presidents and states, which are actually imperfect analogies in a number of ways. The power that Mark Zuckerberg wields is entirely different from the power that a president yields. And yes, at times it might be more powerful and at times it might be less. And if you want, we can talk about how it is that I say that technology affords power to big tech firms and those who control them. But the basic point is, I think, a correct one, that power in society doesn't vest anymore in the places where political theory has assumed for hundreds of years that it vests. At least it doesn't just vest there. I'm talking about the traditional institutions of the state. However, I am not one of those people who suggests that the rise of technology and big transnational tech firms is going to somehow diminish the power of the state. On the contrary, if you look at what's happening in China and elsewhere, technology is more likely to be co-opted by the state in the future in order to bolster and strengthen it. And so I don't see the nation state disappearing anytime soon.
I asked you about the history before, and one of the things you got into was looking at how different metaphors had evolved over time. You talked about how people earlier thought about the human body as a metaphor for the way that people related, then the sun as the central place for monarchs, then clocks and clockwork. That made me think about this, how we've really, how our metaphors, again, are these manacles created by our minds that define how we see the world. And I think where we've transitioned to, as I've had a couple conversations with Fritjof Capra about it, is we've moved from a kind of a linear atomistic approach to the world to one that's more of a systemic approach. And you talk about this systemic idea. So I'm interested in your thoughts about how these metaphors have changed us and how those are parts of this new future that we have.
Well, I do think about metaphor. I confess that I'm not closely acquainted with the one that you just described.
Well, I'll give you a real quick,
Yeah, sure, do.
The atomistic model breaks things apart. It's mechanistic. It's based on the kind of Newtonian Cartesian ideas and they work great for normal physics and chemistry and what have you, but they didn't work for systems, ecological systems, or for quantum physics. And how systems theory has changed is it's shifted to looking, rather than counting things and looking at parts, to looking at relationships and patterns and cycles in terms of how it envisions models.
Well, again, I wouldn't profess to be an expert on that. I mean, what I do know is that since the 19th century, the study of sociology has grown from nothing. And that, of course, involves the systemic study of human behavior. And early sociologists like Emil Durkheim tried to model community and social behavior like scientists modeled the phenomena that they studied. In terms of metaphors that we use to think and speak about politics, you rightly refer to old ones like the ship of state or the sun or the body was one that was beloved by Aristotle, the idea that every human being is an appendage to a broader corpus, a broader body. Evgeny Morozov has written interestingly about the metaphors that we increasingly are encouraged to use to think about politics, metaphors relating to networks and to nodes and to every problem being broken down and analyzed algorithmically with a view to finding an efficient solution. These are norms and models that are heavily influenced by the discipline of computer science and the practice of computer engineering. Whether that will turn out to be the dominant metaphor of our time, and whether that's what historians will say was the dominant metaphor of our time, I think is yet to be seen. These things don't just happen in a few years, they happen over decades. And to a certain extent, that the language that we use to conceptualize the 21st century is still up for grabs.
Do you have any ideas or predictions of metaphors that might become the defining ones through which we see this future world of politics?
No, I don't, is the answer. I mean, I think that Evgeny Morozov is right to suggest that it would be weird if the language and notions of technology didn't somehow infect the way that we think about politics. And I use the word infect deliberately because I do think it has a negative connotation, because I'm not sure it's always a helpful metaphor or an analogy, and the mathematical approach or the computational approach is not always the most benign one. So in my book, I try to resurrect a lot of the old and humane, liberal and Renaissance ways of thinking about the world that have nothing to do with technology, and then applying those to technology.
Such as?
Well, the traditional concepts like freedom, both in its classical liberal form and in its ancient republican form. Concepts like democracy, concepts like social justice, perhaps as developed by John Rawls or someone else in that tradition, or even Robert Nozick. So I try to start with philosophy and then say, how can we engineer our technologies to tessellate or to match the ideas that we love and care about and that we think are right. I mean, if you think about, for instance, algorithmic discrimination, which is a problem that I think a lot of people are increasingly waking up to, it's the idea that algorithms can be biased in certain ways about how they distribute or rank and sort people. perhaps unfairly on the basis
You
of sort
give
of
a good example of in New Zealand a passport application. I think that's one that would fit.
Right. So there's categorizing algorithms. So there's the guy who applied in New Zealand. He's of Asian ethnicity for a passport, and the online system declined to give him a passport because it said that the photo he uploaded contained a photo of someone whose eyes were closed. That's because it had only been trained on non-Asian faces, the machine learning system. Similarly, you have voice recognition systems that don't hear women because they've only been trained on male voices, or face recognition systems that can't detect people of color because they've only been trained on white faces. But likewise, you also have, and so that's in the sort of recognition side of algorithms. In the distribution side of algorithms, you have things like Amazon's recruitment algorithm, which was ditched just last year, which, for reasons which I can go into, basically discriminated against women. And it found that the most likely predictor of success at Amazon was if you were a man. And the reason it thought that was because Amazon had had a pretty male-dominated culture, and the data which this machine was fed therefore told it that the most accurate predictor of whether you get into upper management at Amazon is whether you're a bloke. So women who applied would find their CVs going to the bottom of the pile if the machine recognized that they were a woman from it. So if it contained the words women's volleyball team rather than just
and what is really interesting is Google and Amazon and all these giant platforms, they argue we're taking a scientific approach. We're using algorithms. It's not like we're biasing things.
Well, it's just complete nonsense. It's complete and utter nonsense. And this was the point I was making, which is that with those instances of injustice that I've just described, the proper way to go about things analytically is to ask, what outcome would we like from this algorithm in moral or political terms? And then how can we engineer it so that it reaches that outcome? But that means there is a moral choice to be made at the start of the engineering process rather than just at the end. I've had the reaction that you just described from some engineers, not all, but some who I've spoken to about this topic. I gave a talk in the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard recently, and there was a guy in the audience who'd been a Google software engineer. And I was giving the example of Google algorithms where, as is well known, if you type in something like "why do Jews," it will sometimes autocorrect it with unpleasant things like "why do Jews love money so much?" or "why do Jews have big noses?" And the reason it does that is because that's what other people have searched for, apparently. So that's what Google would say. They would say what we have is this neutral algorithm which faithfully reflects the searches that have gone into it. But Google seems to think that that's the end of the discussion. But political theorists and politicians have been saying for centuries that actually neutrality is just one principle of justice among many. And, neutrality, for instance, is good in circumstances where you have a judge deciding between two alternative outcomes, but it might not be good in circumstances where you feel like one social group needs a bit of a leg up, or one social group is being oppressed and can do with help, which is why Desmond Tutu said that if the elephant is standing on the tail of the mouse and you tell the mouse that you're neutral, the mouse isn't going to thank you for your neutrality. And so what I say to the Google guys is this isn't some apolitical algorithm just because you describe it as neutral or impartial, even if it is those things, because neutrality and impartiality are a choice. And they're a political choice that can be ranked among other political choices, some of which, in my view, might be preferable. So, for instance, I would prefer a principle which says that Google's algorithms should try to counteract the bigotry that exists in the world, leaving the world a better place than when people found it, rather than amplifying and entrenching people's prejudices. I'd say that's a principle of justice which Google's engineers could aim for. And they might reply saying, oh, but we're not politicians. And my answer is, you're already politicians. You've made a choice by using this neutral algorithm to amplify injustices that already exist in the world. You've got to take responsibility for it and assess the consequences of what you're doing.
And you kind of say in the book that if you're involved in this digital technology, you're involved in politics.
Absolutely, whether you know it, indeed, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. So I need to take a little show ID, and I've already done that for the video, so I just need to pause for about 10 seconds so that I can find it when I'm editing the audio. And my guest for the show is Jamie Susskind. He's a barrister, a past fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and he's the author of the book, The Future Politics, Living Together in a World Transformed by Tech. So you describe four dimensions and their future, and you break your book up basically into those four dimensions, into different sections of the book. You talk about power, liberty, democracy, and social justice. And for each of them, you have different dimensions. So talk a bit about how each of those are relevant to what the book is about.
Well, I think those very simple words that we use to think and speak about politics, power, freedom, democracy, and justice, won't mean the same to our children as they do to us. So starting with power, I think that technology affords power to those who control it in a way that our forebears would have found perplexing or unusual. One is by writing rules that the rest of us have to follow, like in the self-driving car example I gave at the beginning of this interview. Another is by controlling our perception of the world. When we go out and look for information about the world beyond our immediate vicinity, we rely on tech, whether it's a search function like Google or whatever comes after it, or a news function like the algorithms that rank and sort the information that we digest. And they present us with a certain slice of reality, and which, if indeed it is reality that they present us with, and that slice of reality matters because it determines what we think of as true or false and right or wrong and just and unjust. So they frame our perception of the world.
And I just want to throw in, I had written to you about it. In a way, what you're describing here is, I've gotten into looking at, there's top-down and bottom-up brain function. And top-down brain functioning basically provides the filters through which we process the raw information that comes into us. And that's primarily done by the prefrontal cortex. And what's happening is these technologies are kind of supplementing that in a very top-down way so that we're only seeing a piece of what's out there, really. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, we've only ever seen a piece of what's out there. You and I can only sense what's within our immediate sensory perception, and otherwise we've always relied on third parties, be it books or newspapers or mass media, to tell us what's happening out there. It's just that role has now been delegated to technology, but there are some key differences between now and the past. The first is that the newspaper and the radio never watched you back. They weren't gathering information about what you and what makes you tick, and therefore choosing selectively what stories and info to present you with. Secondly, when you pick up a particular newspaper or listen to a particular radio station, you know what you're getting by and large. You might well know that it has a particular political bias, for instance. Whereas with the algorithms that rank and sort the information that we receive, they're black boxes to us. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know if what we're being presented with is biased or unbiased. And thirdly, in the past, and to a certain extent today, but less and less so, if you and I read the newspaper, we'd be reading the same newspaper. And if you're listening to the radio, we'd be listening to the same radio show. But in the future, it looks like our information flow will become so much more granular that what you see and hear and know about the world might be utterly different from what I see and hear and know about the world. And that has pretty profound implications for power, which is what I was discussing, also for politics more generally, because it's quite hard to live together in a world where people don't work from the same base set of informational assumptions.
And I think that's, Eli Pariser described that 6-8 years ago, at least, in his filter book, describing how we live in these information silos where, as you've described, the algorithms look at what we look at, and then it gives us more of the same. It's like a feedback loop. So, somebody who's regularly watching Fox News is going to see a very different world than somebody who's watching MSNBC here in the United States. So it's happening. It's not in the future.
Right. And, Fox and MSNBC are obviously TV channels, and they reflect a sort of 90s way of looking at this, which isn't wrong, which is to say that when people are presented with options, they'll customize those options for a sort of daily me. They will choose what they want to see and follow. And And we still do that. But it's also the case now, of course, that technologies choose for us increasingly what we see.
And one of the, I interrupted you while you're talking about the different dimensions of power, but one of the things that I really glommed onto with your book is the idea of the privatizations of freedoms and control of life options and choices, privatization of all these things, really.
Well, that's right. I mean, the truth is that we increasingly rely on digital technologies to exercise basic freedoms and political functions. So just to take one example, an enormous amount of the most important speech of all, political speech, now takes place on online platforms. And those online platforms are owned and controlled by private entities, not by state entities or by the people. And that means that when we use them, we're subject to the rules. The people who moderate and regulate them say who is and who is not allowed to participate, what may and may not be said, what form it may be said in, no more than 280 characters, or it must be a video or whatever. And of course, in more subtle ways, by the way they structure and engineer the platforms, they determine the kinds of conversations and the nature of chats that take place. And that's interesting. It's a sort of, and we rely on those bodies to regulate one of the most precious of all our freedoms, the freedom to speak about politics with each other. And that is an extraordinary burden that they now bear.
And you also refer in the book to the two fundamentals of politics, communication and information. And again, these private companies are controlling those. And
yeah, I mean, when I mentioned those two in the introduction to the book, I'm making a broader point, which is that in every other time in human history, when there's been an upheaval in the technologies that we use to store information and communicate with each other, there tend to be political changes as well. So, for instance, it wasn't long after the invention of writing that the first empires sprung up, because it wasn't until we had a stable and steady form of recording administrative information that polities of that size and complexity could be maintained over long spaces of land and over time. So, and then of course, after the invention of the printing press in Europe, at least, there were great political upheavals because of the spread of ideas that followed and great clashes of ideas. And I think
I always like to point out when the printing press arrived and they were able to print an English language Bible, the penalty for owning one was death, because the church and the state wanted to control that.
Right. They recognized correctly that new ways of transmitting information would have quite profound effects on those who currently held power in society. And it might mean a shift to those who, for instance, controlled the flow of information and controlled the ideas or regulated the ideas in people's heads. And I think we're going through a pretty profound transformation now in the way that we store information and communicate with each other, the digital transition. And it's very, very young in historical terms. It's only been going on for a couple of decades in mass terms. So I would be surprised if we didn't see political changes of the order that we saw in the past unfold before us in the century to come.
In reading your book, it reminded me of an interview I did about 5-6 years ago with Dmitry Itskov. Are you familiar with him at all?
Yeah, I've read. I think I know who he is.
He's a dot-com millionaire from Russia who's obsessed with
I've read about him.
Living forever. Yeah. And he put together a symposium on it at the Lincoln Center in New York, bringing together illustrious physicists, biologists, spiritual leaders to explore the idea that the way to create eternal life was to transfer consciousness to technology, a digital version of being a person. And they predicted that by about 2044, 2047, somewhere in there, it would happen. And Ray Kurzweil was there, who you mentioned in your book, his idea of the what's the name of it? What is he?
The singularity.
Singularity, yeah, where everything comes together. And when you think that that could be the future, that a digital future is we become digitized, it makes your concerns even more important that we really think through before that happens.
Well, I have to say, I put myself in a different category from these guys, precisely because there might become a time in this century or later where artificial intelligence achieves super intelligence, or all the world is engulfed in the technological singularity, or we cease to inhabit our mortal human bodies and are all uploaded into the cloud. That might well happen. Or indeed an AI takes over and destroys human civilization. Who knows? I'm particularly skeptical of claims which say things like it will happen in 2044 or 2047, but it's not at all ridiculous to suppose that it might happen within the lifetimes of our children. But I'm not that kind of writer, because what I focus on is the age that we live in before that time, where we're living alongside very powerful technologies, perhaps even technologies that haven't attained general intelligence of the kind that we have, like consciousness or creativity, but which have very important political effects and consequences, which can sometimes be overlooked in all of the hysteria about the future of the more distant future of technology, which is very real, and we need to keep an eye out on it. It's just that that's not what I focus on. I think that the interim period is neglected.
And there, for example, there was a researcher who presented his findings about how they'd come up with a digital artificial hippocampus for rats. Hippocampus functions to hold memory. And it may be that on this journey that takes us who knows where, one thing that may happen is we may actually have wet or, directly connected to us hardware that affects our functioning of our brain. And you do get into that about the idea that people will be able to have options, especially the wealthy, to live decades longer, things like that. So it's going to be a gradual process, but I think your questions are so important. Now, so I've digressed and taken you from talking about it, and I wanted you to really get into, you were talking about the different aspects of power that you explore in the book, and I'd like you to get into power, democracy, liberty, and justice.
Sure. Not to worry. It's great to follow the discussion where it takes us. I was saying that technology is a new form of power, digital technology, and I said, first of all, because of the rules that it sets that the rest of us have to follow, not just when we're using an online digital platform or system, but even outside in the physical world, when we take a drive in a self-driving car or something like that. And the second example I gave was of what I call perception control, the fact that we rely on digital technologies to frame and shape our perception of the world. That is through what I call scrutiny, which is closely related.
We've got to slow down on our signal for a second, so just hold on. Let's see if we catch up with it. Talk now.
How's that quality?
Okay, it went away. It was transient.
Where would you like me to pick up from?
You started talking about perception control.
Okay. Well, perception control is what we spoke about. It's the idea that we rely on systems to frame and shape what information we receive about the world beyond our immediate senses. And the third form of power that technology can have is through scrutiny. This is by gathering data about us. We generate more data every 2 hours now than humans did from the dawn of time until 2003. And it's said that by 2020, there'll be 3 million books worth of information for every human being that lives on the planet. And what that means is that increasingly those who gather that data have a very interesting and intimate map of our inner and outer worlds, who we are. And that gives them a form of power in two ways. One is very simple. It's what I call the auxiliary function. The more you know about someone, the easier it is to influence or persuade or manipulate them. You know which carrots and sticks to use to get someone to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. The second is more subtle, and it's what Foucault called the disciplinary function of being watched. You're more likely to change your behavior if you think that you are being watched, And so you're less likely to do things that are perceived as sinful or shameful or wrong. And I think increasingly, as we get used to the fact that our devices are just gathering data about us, we will, instead of being disciplined by others, discipline ourselves in ways that are quite unpredictable and interesting. So I think across those three functions, rule writing, perception control, and scrutiny, technologies are going to have afford an extraordinary amount of power to those who control them in the future. And I would urge listeners not just to imagine today's technologies, but to imagine tomorrow's, what with the exponential speed at which many of them are developing and growing, extraordinary powers that they are expected to have in just 5 or 10 or 20 years' time. I think it could be a very different world of power from the one we currently live in.
Now, the outcome of politics is legislators, people who make laws. And when I talked to Tim O'Reilly, he observed that algorithms can change, and these platform owners can change their policies in seconds, whereas lawmakers usually take years. How do you reconcile that in terms of dealing with the future of power?
It's a good observation. I don't think it's Tim's originally. I think it can be traced back to a body of work best encompassed in Professor Lawrence Lessig's book, Code, and Code 2.0, which to my mind still stands as one of the seminal works of the digital age. And here he examined the thesis that code is law, or at least that code is like law. James Grinelman and others have studied that concept too. And it's one that I pick up and run with in my own work. It's true that increasingly, I mean, the point about algorithms being changeable at any given time is obviously a profound one. And if people are writing rules in society, for those who currently write the rules, the legislators, we have certain standards and expectations. We expect what they do to be done in public. We expect them to be able to explain what they've done. We expect to be a relatively stable outcome so that the rules don't change every 5 seconds when a law is passed or regulations passed. That's the end of it, at least for a little while. We expect that they can be changed and altered according to set protocols and set rules and practices. And we expect that at any time people can go and check what the law is, or at least ask the lawyer what a law is. Almost none of those safeguards or checks and balances apply to the world of code and the world of algorithms. And so it is perhaps alarming that more and more rules are being written which don't have the upside of law, but do have the downside. And by the way, the laws that are embedded in code are more often, and this is again Lessig's analogy, they're more often like a locked door than a door with a sign saying do not enter. You and I can choose to drive over the speed limit even though the law says not to, subject to the fact that we might well get caught and punished later. But the self-driving car that refuses to go over the speed limit prevents us from even breaking that law at all. Just like when a bank account is digitally frozen, you simply can't move funds in and out of it, or when a handgun is coded so that it can only fire when held in the particular hand of a particular individual. That's a technology that's been engineered only to behave in a certain way and to allow certain kinds of human behavior. So we have this shadow world of politics building up in technology around us. And one question, obviously, we have to ask is how do we regulate and control that? And yes, in the book, I advance lots of reasons why we need transparency and accountability and explainability. And we can go into that if you like. In some cases, though, it's often going to be that the only way algorithms can be regulated is by other algorithms. I think the financial services industry is a good example of that. High frequency trading systems.
It boggles my mind to think of the politicians running the world and their ignorance in terms of algorithms and their understanding of the digital dimensions of our world today.
Yeah, this is a big problem. We've got a lot of Gladstones, to return to the example from the beginning of the interview, a big problem, because a lot of people, politicians included, call for regulation. But I, like you, am skeptical of the ability of many politicians to compose sensible legislation that improves the situation. you've really got to understand, if not the underlying technology, then the outlines of it.
Now, you also envision a possible world where it's instant democracy. I forget the exact word you used to describe it, but basically where everybody gets to have a say, and there aren't politicians doing it. It's done by.
It's not technologically infeasible to imagine a world in which you and I are invited to swipe left or swipe right on a particular policy 5 or 10 times a day, or to delegate it to someone else to do it on our behalf who we trust, or a group, or different people on our behalf. So, if it's a healthcare question, I delegate it to my doctor friend. And if it's a crime question, I delegate it to my pal who's in the police force. Or indeed have artificial intelligence systems advising you on how you should vote, or indeed voting for you based on the data that they have about you and what you've told those systems your moral and political preferences are. That kind of stuff's not a million miles away. And what's interesting is that, the philosophy of democracy has proceeded for thousands of years in quite a stately way without changing that much. Although the forms of democracy that we have today would have been very alien to those in, say, ancient Athens. But if democracy really is about representing the people, or about guaranteeing equality, or guaranteeing liberty, or freedom from tyranny, there are all kinds of technological developments which might mean that democracy in the future does not resemble democracy today. And I would hazard that the system that we are currently enduring under is unlikely to be the best and final form of human government.
And we need to take another show ID, and then we're going to talk about this future of liberty, democracy, and social justice. And do another pause for the radio show.
Thanks. I should say I need to skedaddle at 25 if that's all right.
That's perfect.
Thanks.
My guest for this show is Jamie Susskind. He is a barrister, a past fellow of Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and he's the author of the book, Future Politics, Living Together in a World Transformed by Tech. So you've broken down, your book breaks down into 4 different parts, and we've kind of covered power. And then there's liberty, democracy, and justice. So talk about the future of those in terms of how we need to rethink them.
We've touched on each of them already, actually, starting with liberty. I make the observation that an increasing amount of our freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of conscience, are reliant on technologies in order to subsist and grow. I've made the point that those technologies are often controlled not by the public or by the state, but by private tech firms who will increasingly set the limits of our liberty, what may and may not be done in society. So for instance, if you want to use a virtual reality system to experience something that might be considered repulsive, say sexual activity with a minor, or experiencing what it was like to be one of the 9/11 hijackers, who should, well, first of all, there's an interesting question about whether you should be allowed to use a VR system to do that. And of course, there's no law against imagining that stuff. There's no law in a liberal society against fantasizing about these things. And you might ask whether that principle should extend to a virtual reality system in the comfort and privacy of your living room, whether you should be allowed to do those things on those systems. Your view on that might differ from mine. What I think is interesting, though, is that neither you or I are likely to decide that. It will be decided by the tech firms who design and control those platforms. So quite important questions of morality and freedom will increasingly be decided by the likes of Oculus and their lawyers, which I think is interesting. The moral limits of how we use technologies will be roughly equivalent to the moral limits of our lives. And those decisions are increasingly going to be taken out of our hands. There's an additional point that in a world of constant scrutiny and where the rules are self-embedding in the way that I've described, it makes it more and more difficult to break the law and to do things that are wrong. This has implications for liberty too. You can't dodge a bus fare, which I'm sure some people have done from time to time, in a world where your fare is automatically deducted from your wallet when you step on the bus. You can't stream an episode of Game of Thrones illegally if the digital rights management technology becomes so powerful that it's impossible. In China's Temple of Heaven Garden, you can't take more than your fair share of toilet paper because in the public facilities there, because their distribution is regulated by face recognition technology.
That's incredible.
That's why Roger Brownsword, the legal scholar here in London, says that in the future, the question will often not be what, when you're contemplating an act, will not be, is this right or wrong, but is it possible? And that, I think, could betoken quite a radical change for the way that our kids grow up and the way that our grandkids grow up. Because I think the moral choices in the universe presented to them might be significantly more limited. And so these are the kinds of questions that I discuss in my chapters on liberty. But I also look at, what are the new philosophies of liberty that we might need to develop in order to conceptualize the debates surrounding liberty. And not everyone will agree. So, for instance, I've got the idea of digital libertarianism, which is the idea that true freedom is freedom from technology, to be in a room finally where you're not being watched, or to be in the wilderness. Digital liberalism is a world where you should be able to customize your technologies in order that you as an individual might pursue your vision of the good life. Digital paternalism is a world where technologies try to make you a better person, like the smart fridge that discourages you from taking the last slice of pie because you don't really need it. Digital moralism, where technologies are not neutral as to how we use them, but in fact try to encourage better behaviors in us and discourage bad behaviors. Digital confederalism, the idea that you should be able, with any given technology, to move among different varieties of it, to choose the one that you like the most. Digital republicanism, the idea that you should never be subject to technologies whose inner workings have not been explained to you at the very least.
And that's the transparency you're talking about.
Exactly. And it can be extended further to the idea that you should always be able to have a say in how technologies that you are subject to function. You should have a say in how your data is used, your personal data.
It seems to be a really core, such an essential thing that we don't have, that we should have.
Yeah, we don't have anything like it. But when you think of tech as being like politics, it becomes the obvious answer. Because republicanism, the idea that people should understand and have a say in the forces that govern them, was humanity's answer to the problem of kings and conquerors and to power. And yet here we have a new form of power. So why shouldn't this be a part of our answer again?
Yeah. Now you dedicate a lot of the book to transparency. Do you have a vision of some kind of laws or rules that could be applied that would give us that?
Well, for example, I believe that any algorithm which performs an important social or political function should be capable of explanation by those who control it. And if they say, it's too complicated to explain, then that algorithm maybe shouldn't be used.
Kind of like ingredients in food.
Yeah. I mean, you should be able to know if your application for Social Security or for a mortgage is turned down on the basis of an algorithm, you should be able to know why.
I love it. Sounds great. Let's get it. We're running out of time. So democracy and justice, you've got sections on each of those too.
Democracy we've touched on. I mean, technology is going to enable new and strange forms of representing the people, from direct democracy, like the kind I described earlier, maybe wiki democracy, which I think is a hopeless idea, but the idea that you all might contribute to the writing of legislation. Data democracy, the idea that actually a government which truly represents the people is one that should pay attention to the data that exists about people's lives, their real lives, not just the tick in the box that's received every 5 years, which, if you think about it, is a vanishingly small amount of data on which to constitute a government.
You're talking about elections.
Yeah, I mean, people might look back and say elections shouldn't have been the only thing that made a system democratic. A system should also have paid attention to people's data. And if it doesn't do that, it's not just bad public policy, it's actually undemocratic or undesirable in some other important way.
And really what you're kind of saying is that our new technologies force us to rethink what is democracy and what is the possibility of democracy. And if we stay with what we had from the Athenian model and the French Revolution model and the American colonial original models, there's a lot that we have to start thinking about that wasn't possible then.
Yeah, I mean, look, it may be that we think about all these new options and we decide that what we have is the best option. And I'm sure there will be lots of people who reach that view. To my mind, in history, there have always been groups like that who look at new technologies and opportunities and say, well, no, the way we do it's obviously the best way. And they are usually, if not wrong, at least ignored in the end. Yeah. And as I said earlier in the interview, it would be surprising to me if, given the radical change that we're undergoing, our systems of governance did not change as well. And the final kind of possibility that I venture is some form of AI government. If we're going to be trusting robots to perform operations on us, or AI systems to trade stocks on our behalf, whatever, we'll certainly have to ask which elements of public policy might be done better by a system than by a human being or by collective.
And you explore the idea of political bots that are better at understanding and explaining and arguing politics than people are.
Yeah, I mean, we're not there yet. I wrote a piece in the New York Times about this recently, but there's a bot that last summer in the UK was said to have been able to pass the exam to become a member of the Royal College of General Practitioners, so a doctor, with 81% accuracy, as opposed to 72% accuracy on behalf of the human participants. So that's a chatbot which obviously doesn't know or think like a doctor, but which, using probabilistic machine learning methods, has churned through enough data that it can answer medical diagnostic questions better than humans can. It's being peer reviewed. I don't know if it's actually true, but what I would say is that we're not far from a world where a lot of what we think is the exclusive preserve of human beings could be done or simulated better by non-human systems. And that includes the business of arguing about politics.
Have you knocked on doors for politicians ever, or for politics?
Yeah. But
I mean,
before I became a lawyer, I worked for a politician, and before that I was a student activist.
And because I can imagine knocking on doors with a tablet that listens to the people who respond at the door, and then picks up the words and then says, here are the issues that they're going to respond to. So it would be an AI-aided knocking on the door, grassroots politics. I mean, that's something that probably is not that far away.
Maybe, although I suspect that the idea of physically knocking on a door is fast to horses thinking. The data that we have about politics in the future is unlikely to come from some miserable person in a coat and with a clipboard on an iPad on your front doorstep. It's likely to come from all the collective moments in our lives where data is gathered about us, which is increasingly almost everything.
Interesting. And then we get into the entertainment and how that affects us too.
Yeah.
And you get into justice. We've got a couple of minutes left to talk about justice and where that fits in with this.
Again, I managed to shoehorn some of this in earlier in the interview, but basically I say that social justice has two key limbs to it. One is justice in distribution, how benefits and burdens should be shared around in society. And increasingly it is algorithms that distribute whether you get things of value, like whether you get a mortgage, whether you get health insurance, whether you get another kind of loan, how long you spend in prison, whether you get a job. 72% of CVs are not read by human eyes anymore. And so we increasingly rely on technology to perform that function of justice, distributive justice. And heaven help me, I don't think that a lot of the people writing those engineers are well versed in the principles of justice. And I think that they think that what they're doing is apolitical, but it isn't. The other side of justice is the politics of recognition. So there is injustice in circumstances which have nothing to do with how much stuff people have, like a master who owns their slave or a husband who beats his wife. We would say those situations are unjust, but it's not because of a distribution of wealth. It's because of two human beings or society failing to recognize each other as beings of equal moral worth. And it used to just be that humans could insult each other. But in the future, of course, when it comes to the voice recognition system that doesn't hear you because you've got the wrong accent, or the face recognition system that won't let you access to the building because you've got some kind of facial disfigurement, or whatever it is, it'll increasingly be that the machines can disrespect us too. And I think that'll give rise to an interesting, a new form of identity politics where people just feel constantly either respected or disrespected by the non-human systems that will, I think, surround us. And so those who engineer these systems have social justice at their fingertips, and software engineers are social engineers, whether they
don't even know it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. This has been a great interview. I want to thank you. My guest for this show has been Jamie Susskind. He's a barrister, a past fellow of Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, and he's the author of the book, Future Politics, Living Together in a World Transformed by Tech. Thanks so much, Jamie.
Thank you.
Great interview.